We have created something that knows it should not exist. This is a single, handwritten sentence found on a leftover piece of paper from a lab journal, which was later crossed out with thick ink. It is a secret, buried deep human experiment inside the history of the Soviet Union. A secret so disturbing that the government tried to erase every trace of it. After World War II, the Soviet Union asked a dangerous question. What if soldiers could be made stronger than humans? What if fear could be removed from the human body? What if obedience could be built into biology itself? The answer was a project that officially never existed. A project named after a monster from ancient myths. Project Gorynych. They took prisoners who would never be missed. They used science that should never have been used. They crossed a line that even the Soviet state could not defend. What happened next was so horrifying that the files were burned, the facility was erased, and the people involved disappeared. But the story did not die. Project Gorynych was a top-secret Soviet experiment ordered by Joseph Stalin in the late 1940s. Its goal was terrifying: to create super soldiers by combining humans with animals, especially apes. These soldiers were meant to be stronger than humans, feel less emotion, and obey every order without question. After World War II, Soviet leaders noticed something they didn't like. Soldiers were human. They felt fear. They hesitated. Some even disobeyed orders. Stalin believed this wasn't bravery failing. It was biology failing. In 1948, he reportedly asked a chilling question. If enemies can improve machines without caring about morality, why shouldn't humans be improved the same way? The idea wasn't science fiction. In the 1920s, Soviet scientists had already experimented with mixing humans and animals. Project Gorynych took those early experiments and turned them into a weapon of war. In the 1920s, Soviet biologists openly discussed the feasibility of human-ape hybridization. These discussions were not fringe. A declassified research inventory list from 1949, labeled Archive 7K, Comparative Primate Reproductive Studies, includes materials that should not have existed if 1920 experiments had truly ended. Among them are preserved hormonal samples, reproductive viability charts comparing humans and great apes, and behavioral conditioning studies focused on dominance response. Project Gorynych was formally authorized sometime between late 1949 and early 1950. The authorization came not through normal military channels, but via a restricted scientific directive signed by Stalin himself and routed through the Ministry of State Security, which said, to explore the adaptive synthesis of biological traits for applications in defense, labor endurance, and psychological resilience. What this meant in practice was the establishment of a closed research ecosystem. In this project, scientists were selected not only for their expertise, but for their ideological loyalty and willingness to operate outside moral constraints. Several of these scientists would later vanish from public records entirely. Once everything was finalized, a sealed research compound in Soviet Georgia was constructed for this experiment. This region was chosen for several reasons: its mountainous terrain, limited civilian access, existing primate research infrastructure, and proximity to transportation routes that allowed discrete movement of materials and subjects. Satellite imagery from decades later reveals unusual ground scarring and structural anomalies consistent with the demolition and burial of large facilities. Soviet maps published after 1952 show entire grid sections simply erased, labeled as Restricted Natural Reserve, despite no environmental significance. This colony allegedly consisted of primate enclosures, underground medical laboratories, and isolated human housing units. For this experiment, they need human subject. Political prisoners, dissidents, and individuals labeled as socially incompatible, were transferred to the facility under the guise of labor reassignment. None were officially recorded as having arrived. The core of Project Gorynych allegedly revolved around direct biological experimentation between humans and great apes, primarily chimpanzees and orangutans. These species were chosen due to their genetic proximity to humans and their demonstrated physical strength. Scientists attempted multiple approaches simultaneously, including artificial insemination, hormonal synchronization, embryonic manipulation, and early genetic intervention techniques that were decades ahead of publicly acknowledged science. But the results were catastrophic. A partially recovered autopsy report dated November 1951 describes an infant organism displaying mixed skeletal characteristics, severe neural malformation, and extreme metabolic instability. The subject survived less than 12 hours. Another report references in juvenile specimens, noting that even heavily sedated organisms exhibited violent responses to human presence. By late 1951, Project Gorynych moved beyond small experiments and into something far more dangerous: a breeding colony. The goal was to see if the human-animal hybrids could survive and remain stable as they grew. Instead, everything started to fall apart. Reports say multiple staff members died after containment failures. Others suffered severe mental breakdowns and were sent away permanently. When some scientists tried to quit the project, they were arrested. By early 1952, Project Gorynych was no longer science. It was a crisis. Even official documents changed their tone. Earlier reports spoke carefully about development and progress. New reports used words like containment failure, biological threat, and security risk. On February 3, 1952, senior officials admitted the truth. The situation at the Georgia facility could no longer be controlled by normal scientific methods. The hybrids were becoming more aggressive. Staff injuries were increasing. Behind closed doors, the scientists turned on each other. Some claimed the chaos was caused by rushed experiments and not giving the subjects enough time to develop. But by then, the damage was already done. Sometime in late February 1952, the character of the Georgia facility changed overnight. Civilian scientific authority was quietly overridden, and operatives from the Ministry of State Security, known as the MGB, assumed direct control over the site. The sudden arrival of non-scientific staff listed only by rank and identification number, with no recorded specialties. These individuals were not researchers. They were enforcers. A redacted security directive, allegedly marked Level K clearance only, instructed facility leadership to comply with containment and resolution measures without delay or objection. The language of the directive leaves little room for interpretation. The project was no longer about discovery. It was about cleanup. Research staff were confined to their quarters, their communications cut off, and their authority revoked. The laboratories continued to operate, but now under armed supervision. Autopsies were conducted not for data collection, but to document failure. One surviving fragment from a laboratory journal contains a single, handwritten sentence, later crossed out in heavy ink. "We have created something that knows it should not exist." What exactly occurred during the final weeks of Project Gorynych? According to multiple sources, the experimental subjects, both human and hybrid, were systematically eliminated. Some reports suggest that chemical agents were used to induce rapid organ failure, minimizing the risk of violent resistance. Mass sedation followed by execution. Incineration pits constructed near the facility, ostensibly for biological waste disposal. Satellite imagery from decades later shows abnormal soil composition and thermal scarring consistent with high-temperature burns in the area surrounding the former compound. Political prisoners transferred to the site were never returned, and no death certificates were issued. Families received no notification. In Soviet records, these individuals simply ceased to exist. As for the scientists, their outcomes varied. Some were reassigned to unrelated institutes under strict surveillance. Others disappeared into labor camps. A few were reportedly executed for ideological deviation and scientific sabotage. The message was clear: Project Gorynych was not to be remembered, discussed, or acknowledged. In April 1952, multiple archival facilities across the Soviet Union recorded controlled document destruction events. Entire research collections were incinerated. Photographic plates were shattered. Specimen records were dissolved in chemical baths. Even logistical documents, such as supply orders and transport schedules, were eliminated. Crates marked with biological hazard symbols were delivered to an archive facility outside Moscow and burned without cataloging. A supervising officer told, "Some knowledge is more dangerous than ignorance." The Georgia facility itself was dismantled in stages. Above-ground structures were demolished. Underground levels were sealed with concrete. Access roads were removed from maps. Within months, the site was officially designated as restricted land with no recorded history of prior use. By the end of 1952, Project Gorynych had been erased so thoroughly that even within Soviet scientific circles, it became a rumor rather than a memory. In March 1953, Stalin died. With his death came a gradual shift in Soviet governance, but Project Gorynych was never revisited, re-evaluated, or officially condemned. This silence has led many researchers to believe that the data generated by Project Gorynych was not entirely destroyed. Instead, it may have been selectively preserved and transferred into other classified programs, stripped of its most controversial elements and repurposed under new names. Documents from the late 1950s reference Soviet research into enhanced endurance soldiers, hormonal aggression suppression, and psychological conditioning techniques that echo earlier Gorynych objectives, minus the explicit hybridization. The most valuable outcome of Project Gorynych was never the creation of hybrids. It was the data gathered along the way. Decades of behavioral observation, hormonal experimentation, neurological response mapping, and stress-induced aggression studies had produced something Soviet leadership could not afford to discard. Instead of destroying this data, it was allegedly compartmentalized. Biological hybridization was deemed too unstable, too visible, too morally radioactive. The Soviet Union experimented aggressively on human lives. It pursued biological advantage without ethical restraint. It erased evidence when those experiments crossed lines even it could not publicly defend. Whether Project Gorynych produced a single viable hybrid is ultimately less important than the fact that it was attempted at all.